Today, we will enter into Chapter 29, Section 2. So we are now into the time period in which the war definitely begins, and we're going to take a look at the two fronts, really, of this major world war. The Western Front, which would be on the border of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and France, basically. And then a little bit at the end, we'll talk about the Eastern Front, which would be the border of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia. Those are really the two major fronts that Germany was forced to fight on both of them. And we will talk about that today. Now, I do want to suggest that there is classic piece of literature called All Quiet on the Western Front. Very historic book about World War I. There is also an old school movie. If you guys wanted to check that out to get a little bit more of a visual, that is there for you. The textbook has some visuals and some maps that obviously you should have read by this point. But today we're going to talk about how what was known back then as the Great War begins. Roman numeral 1 is that. And then a little bit of an introduction as sort of a recap from section 1. So as you should recall from the previous lecture, once Austria declares war on Serbia, Russia counters that with declaring war on Austria. And when I say Austria, I'm talking Austria-Hungary. Russia actually mobilized troops to the Austrian border. They took a very proactive approach and actually mobilized troops to the German border as well. They know that Germany's boys with Austria, and so when they make this move, Germany then declares war on Russia, which happened on August 1st, 1914. So 2 days after declaring war on Russia, Germany then did declare war on France. So we've got all the moves being made, and we're going to take a look at what ends up happening here. Capital letter B is going to talk about how some of those alliances that we learned about in section 1 sort of shift a tad bit. By mid-August of 1914, there were two clear opponents in Europe. On one side, you had what came to be called the Central Powers. This was formerly known as the Triple Alliance. They become known as the Central Powers. Basically, it becomes Germany and Austria-Hungary with support from Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire. These are two small players in World War I. The Ottomans were in a state of decline, but they did get involved in World War I quite a bit. On the other side became known as the Allies. What was once the Triple Entente now is known as the Allies. This is Great Britain, France, and Russia. They were actually supported by Japan. Not a lot of folks know that Japan was involved on the Allied side in World War I. They were also supported by Italy, who, as we saw in section 1, was on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary. And then, of course, we have Serbia in on this side because they're boys with Russia. Now let's talk about Italy. Italy seems to have switched teams here. This is because they were a former member of the Triple Alliance, but they felt like Austria unjustly started the war by not negotiating a bit with Serbia. And so they were a little bit uncertain about that, and they jumped ship and came to the Allies' side. Europe's forces are now on the march. To be honest with you, most documents that you read in history books will tell you that everybody pretty much thought this was going to be over in just a few weeks or months due to all the technological advancements that had been made in the form of weaponry and technology. But we know that was not true. And one of the reasons was the state of the war being in trenches, that we'll talk about that, known as the bloody stalemate. Literally, the conflict moved very slowly. The fall of 1914 put a pretty big halt to movement by either side. Both armed forces became deadlocked in the battlefields of northern France. This was known as the Western Front, which is the region of northern France where this deadlock took place. I will do my best to switch here to a map. This is from your textbook, and this map shows you not only the Western Front here, this is kind of the border between France and Germany, but also the Eastern Front over here, which we'll learn about later. But most of the early fighting was happening right over here. Belgium, Luxembourg, France, outside of Paris here, Battle of Verdun, Battle of the Somme. Okay, these are some of the major areas where the early battles were taking place. Now, if you couldn't see that map, I do apologize. It is in your book. I think it's somewhere around page 845, 846, which will talk to you about what I was basically stating there. But the whole idea is the Western Front is that region of northern France on the border of Germany through Belgium and things of that nature in today's world. Point number 3 is that Germany had the very difficult task that we sort of alluded to in section 1 of fighting the war on two fronts. Their plan for fighting the war on two fronts was called the Schlieffen Plan. It was developed by the German general Alfred Graf von Schlieffen, and it called for attacking and defeating France in the west first, and then rushing to fight back to the Eastern Front to fight the Russians. Now, this is very important. It hinges on this fact. The Germans believe they can accomplish this plan, first of all, because they think the Russians do not have a very good railroad system, and their idea is that it's going to take Russia a great deal of time to get their troops to the Eastern Front. Unfortunately for Germany, in fact, it only took the Russians 10 days to get set up at the front. So they moved much quicker than was expected by the Germans. The other idea here before we move on is that they believe France is weak. They believe they can take out France in a matter of days. That's what the Schlieffen Plan really believes. It's attack France first, defeat them extremely quickly, and then leave some troops there in France to solidify things, and then rush back to the Eastern Front to deal with the Russians. Now, please understand that when I say this, I don't mean that the entire German army is going to France first. Obviously, they're going to have to defend their eastern border, so they are going to have troops on that border. The vast majority, though, of the military is going to go to France first. The plan actually seemed to be working in early September. The Germans were driving the French back into the outskirts of Paris. The Allies regrouped, though, and began to push the Germans back into what's known as the Valley of the Marne, which is northeast of Paris. That same map that I had earlier, or that's in your book on 846, will show you that. After 4 days of fighting, the Germans were finally forced to retreat. This first major battle on the Western Front, which was the Battle of the Marne, was a huge event in the war because the Allied side came out victorious, which basically meant that the Germans have destroyed any hopes of the Schlieffen Plan working, because it hinged on the idea that they had to defeat France quickly at first, and they lose the first battle. So it's pretty much where the Germans are now going to have to divide their army into two halves. They're going to keep, one half on the Western Front to deal with France and Great Britain, and then the other half is going to go deal with Russia on the eastern side. The way that they fought during this war was called trench warfare. Soldiers fought each other from each side of what are called trenches. They're dugout strips of land that provide cover. Life in these trenches was absolutely miserable. Men did not bathe for months. The smell of rotting bodies was abundant. Literally, rats were everywhere. Mud, rain, wetness, a lack of fresh food. You're eating canned rations. All of this was compounded by the fact, guys, that's bad enough in itself, but you're getting shelled by bomb after bomb from the opposite side during this whole time, and from airplanes that are dropping bombs. Now, the way that I've learned it, most airplanes that dropped bombs in World War I, the pilot literally had to physically drop the bomb out of the plane. They didn't have mechanisms yet that where you could press a button and it dropped bombs out of planes. I mean, maybe later in the war, but early on, that's basically what we're looking at there. Also, when you fired the machine gun in the front of the plane, it had to be timed so that it didn't shoot through the propeller, because propellers were on the front of these planes and your gun was also in the front. So if you ever play like an old school military game that you're flying in a World War I fighter plane, you'll hear the sound go ba-da-da, 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 and it'll shoot in intervals. That's because it's shooting in between the different propellers that are rotating around. If it shot straight through, it would literally shoot off the propeller and you would crash. So, if you're used to watching Top Gun, all right, with Tom Cruise, with F-14 Tomcats, this is nowhere near that type of dogfighting going on. Let me see if I can switch here and show you guys this quick picture here, which is trench warfare. I know it's a little bit blurry, but let's say that basically this is the British side over here, and then you'd see that pretty much the same thing over here. This would be the German side, okay? Now, what you've got in the back is you've got those artillery, which I was talking about, that are firing big shells, big bombs. You've got these different trenches here are dugout strips of land. This would be what's called your reserve trench. This is where guys would go to take naps and get their sleep and try to stay away from bombs coming from this side. Then you have things like dugouts. They would dig 15, 20 meters under the soil, and they'd have a little dugout, which was safe for the commanders. But sometimes these did collapse. I don't know if you guys have ever watched the film 1917, which just came out recently. It's a really good movie. I wish I could show it to you guys. I wish we were in class. I would figure out a way to do it. But it is on things like Fandango now and Vudu and other streaming services. You can rent it and watch it. So it's pretty cool. But then this trench here is called the reserve trench. This is where guys are, actively moving in and out from what's called the frontline trench. This is the frontline trench. And then in between, let's say this is the British side, this is the German side, in between is called no man's land. No man's land is where there's barbed wire, other fortifications, there's huge craters from shells and bombs that have been dropped. The reason it's called no man's land is because nobody truly owns it at this point. This side over here is trying to capture it by invading the other side's trenches, and this side here is trying to capture this side by invading their trenches. The problem is when you enter no man's land, what these guys basically do, kind of looking like this down here. Let me scroll down for you. Kind of, if you're in the trench, it kind of looks something like this. There's these wooden barriers, and you stand there with your gun, and sometimes you fire back and forth because, no man's land could be as close as 25 yards, 50 yards, where you might make a shot. But then it could also be miles apart. Okay. What you do is you jump, the sergeant blows a whistle, tweet, you jump out of your trench and you start running this way. Unfortunately, usually what happens is these guys are just sitting here waiting for you with machine guns and other weapons, and they just mow you down. There's really no place for cover in no man's land. And so a lot of people lose their lives. And you're really not gaining much. So it's really just a brutal type of warfare, guys, that existed. But the point was to take your men and take over the opposite army's trench. Okay. And some of these trenches, they would last for miles and miles going along the Western Front. So this was not an easy style of warfare. Okay. Back to the lesson here. Now, I just talked about these couple of points. I'm going to go down to point number 5. In trench warfare, at a certain battle called the Battle of the Somme in 1916, a soldier was expected, this is a British soldier, a soldier was expected to carry the following items. Please listen to this. A rifle, a bayonet. Bayonet is it's like a little dagger you fix to the end of your rifle. Grenades, 170 rounds of ammunition, a gas mask, because in World War I, they had poison gas that they would fire into the trenches. So you had to have a gas mask or you would die or your skin would disintegrate. This is crucial stuff. You'd have to have a shovel for digging trenches, wire cutters for cutting barbed wire if you're in no man's land. You had to have a full water bottle, food rations, extra clothing, medical supplies, and even a portable stove with fuel. That would have been made out of propane. Now, let me tell you, if you're running across no man's land with a full propane tank and that thing gets shot by a bullet, or hit by a bullet, you're in big time trouble. So that would be the first thing that I'd be leaving behind if I was in this war, but I'm not. Guys, that's a grand total of 66 pounds. Now, if any of you guys know me, and I know some of you guys play football, but we would have to, I was a defensive back in college, so we would weigh ourselves and we'd weigh our equipment. We would try to be as light as possible because we're going up against receivers who know where they're running and we don't. And we were just trying to be as quick and as agile as possible. So we wore the minimal amount of equipment that we could get away with legally. But really, when we would weigh that, the highest that we ever got with our helmet included was about 27 pounds. Okay. So 66 pounds is double that and more. And so one of the things that you have to really understand is that they are carrying around a lot of weight, and the stakes are much higher in war. You're fighting for your life. You're trying to survive. Anything that's going to slow you down is something that you might want to cut. I'm looking at this list and thinking about, hey, what am I going to try to cut to make myself more elusive? This was known as the terrain of death, guys. The Western Front stretched about 500 total miles from the North Sea all the way down to the Swiss border of Switzerland. Now, that also is shown on the map on page 846. It's something called the Maginot Line there. New tools of war came out during this time, such as the machine gun, poison gas, as we talked, armored tanks, large artillery, and even submarines were in play in World War One. These inventions really did nothing to speed up the war, but what it did is it allowed for the death of more soldiers. I mean, it really, really took a toll on the battlefield. For example, just at this one battle in 1916, the Battle of Verdun, each side, the Allies and, of course, the Central Powers, lost more than 300,000 men. At the Battle of the Somme in 1916, more than 20,000 British soldiers alone were lost. By the time the battles of Verdun and Somme had ended in November 1916, each side had lost over 500,000 men in just two battles. Okay? And you might ask, well, for what? At the Battle of Verdun, the Germans were successful. They gained about 4 miles of territory, guys. 500,000 men for 4 miles. At the Somme, the British gained 5 miles back. So you've got a total exchange of 1 mile there, and you've lost over 1,000,000 men. I don't know about you, but gosh, that is just awful. And that's just part of war that is so sad. It's just very, very sad to study about that and understand that so many people died, and really they were not gaining anything. It'd be one thing to see a gain, which would lead to the war ending early. It's never good to talk about people dying for any reason like that. But, at least it would have ended quicker and you'd have fewer deaths. Make sure, though, that you guys are studying those new weapons of war, which really did change not the speed of war, but really the dangers of war. There's an insert box in your text on page 848 that I would like you guys to get acquainted with. Okay, we're going to switch our focus here toward the end of lecture to the Eastern Front, which, as we learned earlier, was on the border of Russia and Germany and Austria-Hungary. The Eastern Front was that stretch of battlefield. On this front, you had the Russians and the Serbians going to battle against Germany and Austro-Hungarians. Now, Germany counterattacked the early Russian advances at the Battle of Tannenberg. The Germans thoroughly routed the Russians and drove them into full retreat mode here. The Russians lost 30,000 men over 4 days. Russia had more success in attacking the Austrians, but later in the war, the Austrian army forced the Russians out of Austria-Hungary entirely. Now, so they really didn't have much success against either the Germans or the Austro-Hungarians. Capital B, let's talk about Russia's struggles. Russia was a country that did not really industrialize during the Industrial Revolution. They're a little bit behind. Therefore, their army lacked the proper food, guns, ammo, clothing, boots, and other necessities that many of the other European powers had. The Allies were unable to transport support goods to the Russians because the German Navy had excellent submarine power in the Baltic and North Seas, which prevented us from getting that way to Russia. Russia did have the largest population, though, and therefore employed the most soldiers. The problem with this is that I've read documents where Russia would travel in packs of 4 soldiers. They'd have one gun. When the first guy got shot, the next guy would pick up the gun, and so on and so forth, guys. It was that bad as far as how limited on supplies they were. And this is one of the big reasons why they eventually withdraw from the war, but also the Bolshevik Revolution, the revolutions taking place in Russia caused them to also drop out because they had they were fighting a war and fighting basically a revolution within their own country. So the thing about it is that the sheer number of soldiers that the Russians had was able to buy time for the Allies on the Eastern Front, and it did keep Germany and Austria-Hungary occupied on those two fronts, and it made the Schlieffen Plan a lot harder to accomplish. Okay, gentlemen, that has been Chapter 29, Section 2. Next up, we will see Section 3. We'll talk about how the Allies eventually win the war, and then what is the aftermath there. Thank you.